Platinum Games
淳稲葉
has an interesting interview/article describing Platinum's approach to beat-em-up design. From what I understand, in his view, beat-em-ups or action games are passive games where the player makes choices as a response to the enemy's action or the situations the designers put them in. Because of this, he warns against using player moves as the starting point, what he calls functional design. Instead, he advocates thinking of situations and then designing abilities around those situations. I strongly disagree with both the enemy/situation-driven approach and the player mechanics-driven approach. Instead, I'd like to offer a different way of looking at action games. Action games are fundamentally competitive. The competition consists of two things: the struggle to take a limited resource, typically space or time, and the ability to take advantage of said central resource to further tip the scales in your favor, which I'll call snowballing. You want to ask some simple questions. What resource are the actors trying to get? How do they get more of that resource? And how does this resource help them get even more of an advantage? These dynamics are very clear in a competitive multiplayer setting. Fighting game players want to push each other into a corner in order to limit the number of viable offensive and defensive moves the opponent has at their disposal. The less tools the opponent has, the easier they will be to pressure and push further back. Meters are another mechanic that makes this competition very clear. But these dynamics don't disappear when you look at asymmetric single-player games. Single-player competition simply changes form. Instead of being a battle between two equivalent actors, it's a battle between an actor and a game's antagonistic forces. It can be other actors, like enemies, forces like gravity, or abstract systems like score. Let's look at how a genre I love very much handles it: bullet hell shmups. Enemies spawn based on a timer. They come from above, making the upper part of the screen a death zone. The player can only shoot in front of him, making it impossible or highly inefficient to hit enemies diagonally. The sides of the screen are walls, and enemies shoot at your ship. The amount of viable moves you can do heavily depends on how close you are to the corners of the screen. The closer you are, the less options you will have at your disposal. Eventually, you will be trapped, forcing you to either rely on lucky dodges, use a bomb, or die. As a result, the player must optimize enemy kills and bullet pattern this direction to fight for the central resource, screen space. If the screen is clear, the player can set up quick kills more efficiently. They'll have more room to misdirect patterns and more room to correct for mistakes. This doesn't just apply to the player though. The enemies taken as one collective actor work on the same principle. Their goal is to push you away, corner, and trap you. The less screen space the player has to work with, the more meaning random bullets have, as they go from random clutter to deadly obstacles. When enemies force you into corners, they're left with even more time to fill the screen with bullets without the risk of getting shot. Bullets and even hole patterns aren't necessarily discrete challenges the player has to overcome, but rather single steps in a greater game plan that the enemies have. On the other hand, many rail shooters such as Kid Icarus Uprising show how removing limitations and treating attacks as discrete challenges starts to break down these dynamics. Unlike bullets and shmups, the bullets' hitboxes don't exist on the playfield for most of the bullet's lifetime, only activating for a brief period of time when they enter your plane. As a result, their ability to be a persistent, lingering obstacle is almost non-existent. Because enemies also don't exist on the same plane as the player, players are able to move anywhere on the screen without much risk attached. The sides of the screen are no longer traps that the player must avoid, and the players can just keep going in circles. The player also doesn't have to be carefully positioned to kill enemies, because they can aim and shoot anywhere on the screen at any time. The shmup equivalent of this would be if you got teleported to the other side of the screen once you reached an edge, and if your shot covered the whole screen. As a result of all this, there's not much snowballing going on both sides. The players can't gain a strong long-term advantage, and the enemies don't have a strong game plan either. Each threat and each victory is isolated. If we move away from shmups and look at beat-em-ups/character action games, this analysis works just as well. Final Fight is a good example. The player's character is rather slow. The only non-contextual defensive option they have costs health. Jumping is short and doesn't cover much distance, so it can be used to reset bad situations or evade enemies. Attacks are one-directional and require commitment. They broadly have two goals: competing for time. The player wants to keep enemies in an inactive state through hit stun/knockdowns as much as possible. Competing for space, the player wants to keep enemies clumped up and on one side of the screen in order to avoid being surrounded, and to have an escape route if things go poorly. When the player achieves one of these conditions, the game opens up. Inactive enemies let you reposition, which feeds back into your competition for space, while clumping up enemies let you use more risky or situational attacks, like jump attacks and enemy throws more effectively, and keep enemies in an inactive state permanently, since you can hit the whole group at once. The enemy attacks go against this idea of passive design. They have very quick, high-priority attacks with almost no counter. If an enemy is attacking you, then you've already made a mistake somewhere. They are essentially walking obstacles that shrink your player area by making being there highly risky. Enemies are designed to play around with space. Besides straightforward walk up and punch enemy types, their AI is also programmed to play footsies in order to stay outside the player's melee range, walk around or even get behind the player, or jump over the player entirely and then attack from behind. They benefit from having extra space because this gives them enough breathing room to spread out. It prevents the player from hitting them right as they wake up, and it lets them initiate high priority or ranged attacks, which the player cannot do much about. And of course, once the player is knocked down, they don't stop. Instead, they do ground pound attacks or reposition, putting even more pressure on the player. This doesn't just apply to niche games. Resident Evil 4's enemies slowly but surely try to corner the player. Because Leon's gun has startup, possibly some delay in aiming and recovery frames, distance to enemies determines your attacks, even down to the weapons you can use. Add Ashley into the mix and you have even more targets for the villagers to put pressure on. The player then fights back by winning back space and time with stuns and kicks, which gives them more breathing room and influences their next action. It's a loop that feeds back into itself. And of course, God Hand is an extension of Resident Evil 4's dynamic, where counter hits enable you to manage crowds and create favorable situations. And getting enemies next to walls opens up your options substantially. Tetris has a more abstract and direct version of this dynamic. The game uses time to push you into a corner, compound your mistakes, and limit the number of viable stacking options you have. The player, on the other hand, tries to free up the screen by getting line-clear combos. This way of looking at action games creates a more fundamental principle against which player/enemy moves, environmental elements, or unique situations can be measured. You can ask very clear questions like, do players and enemies have a game plan? Do they have enough tools to pursue their game plan? Do their small wins stack and give them a long-term advantage? Can they fully capitalize on said advantage? Do different level elements impede or help these goals, and how? The best games are IMO, the ones that have a healthy balance of the players' and enemies' ability to pursue their goals, and have large amounts of snowballing going on both sides. Well-balanced games can work with extremely simple mechanics, such as King of Dragons having just one attack. The worst games lack this balance. They have slow, non-threatening enemies with well-telegraphed attacks, and can't corner the player, because the player has advantage/disadvantage reset mechanics, such as long jumps or iframe dodges. As a result, winning against an enemy is unrewarding because it doesn't give you any strong long-term advantage. In many cases, enemies will outright prevent you from interacting with them in any meaningful way, by having armor, not having knockdown states, and not having any interaction with other enemies. Importantly, this analysis should be applied to specific encounters and other smaller stretches of gameplay. If you start looking at the entire game, the meta goal, like arriving to the boss with a lot of health, will obscure lackluster moment-to-moment dynamics. Also, games are obviously more complicated than a framework, and you need to approach this charitably and fill in some blanks. No rules, only tools.